It was supposed to be a simple trade deal, one that would strengthen ties between the United States and Canada. The $35 billion F-35 contract had been years in the making, touted as a symbol of unwavering defense cooperation between the two nations. But everything changed with a single announcement. On a quiet Friday morning, as President Trump prepared for his usual routine, the news hit like a thunderclap. Canada had cancelled the deal. No warning. No explanation, just a cold, formal statement that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon and the White House. The entire world was watching, and Donald Trump was blindsided. At first, it seemed like an unfortunate mistake. Surely, the Canadians wouldn't pull the rug out from under the US like this, right? But as the hours went by and no official word came from the Canadian government, the truth began to sink in. Canada had just upended Trump's carefully constructed foreign policy playbook. Trump, visibly frustrated, held an impromptu meeting in the Oval Office. The anger was palpable as he paced back and forth, phone in hand, dialing his closest advisors. He had no idea what had happened. All he knew was that this was a major blow to his already embattled presidency. "I need answers, and I need them now," Trump snapped into the phone, slamming the receiver down as his staff shuffled around him. The stakes were higher than anyone could have predicted. Canada's bold move had thrown everything into chaos. What had led to this decision? Who had made it? And most importantly, what would be the fallout for both countries? By mid-afternoon, the pressure was mounting. The media had gotten wind of the cancellation, and the news networks were on overdrive. Reporters swarmed around the White House, demanding answers. Trump's approval ratings had already been on shaky ground, but this was a whole new level of disaster. The F-35 deal wasn't just about planes, it was about trust, economic promises, and the fragile nature of international relationships. As the president sat behind his desk, a grim expression on his face, his advisors gathered in the Oval Office. They knew this wasn't just a simple trade hiccup, it was a diplomatic nightmare. "Mr. President," one of the senior aides began, "we've got to figure out why Canada did this. They're claiming budgetary concerns, but that doesn't make sense. Why now, after everything's been agreed upon?" Trump shot the aide a sharp look. Budgetary concerns? That's the excuse. They've been sitting on this deal for years, and now they pull it just like that. There was a pause, the tension thick in the air. "We need to speak to the Canadian Prime Minister. Someone's got to explain this mess." The White House quickly contacted Ottawa, demanding an immediate explanation. But as the hours ticked by, the Canadians remained silent. It was as if they had already made up their minds and didn't care what the US thought. Then, out of nowhere, a cryptic tweet from the Canadian Prime Minister went viral: "The future of our defense strategy doesn't align with a $35 billion price tag. It's time to look elsewhere." The tweet was short, direct, and incredibly cutting. Trump's face turned red with fury as he read the tweet over and over again. The bluntness of it stung. This wasn't just a rejection of a deal, it was a slap in the face. "We've been betrayed," Trump muttered, pacing again. "This is going to be bigger than anyone realizes." The fallout from Canada's decision to cancel the deal spread like wildfire. The Pentagon was scrambling to assess the immediate impact, while the State Department worked overtime to salvage what little was left of the bilateral relationship. But in the political heart of Washington, it was Trump who bore the brunt of the blame. "We gave them everything," Trump ranted during a private meeting with his top advisors. "The best fighter jets, the best equipment, and what do we get in return? A middle finger." He slammed his fist on the table, causing a few aides to flinch. "This is embarrassing." The president's rage was justified, but his advisors knew the political reality was far more complex. This wasn't just about a failed arms deal, it was about Trump's leadership, his approach to foreign policy, and the perception of weakness on the world stage. The cancellation of the F-35 deal wasn't just a lost contract. It was a message. The media were relentless, with pundits and politicians from both sides of the aisle questioning how Trump could have been so blindsided. His political opponents were quick to pounce, calling the cancellation yet another example of his ineptitude in handling international relations. Trump promised to make America strong again, but it looks like he's getting outplayed by Canada of all countries, said a Democratic senator in a live interview. If he can't even secure a deal with our neighbors to the north, how can we trust him to protect us from real threats? In the midst of the chaos, an emergency press briefing was scheduled. The world was watching. The president was about to address the nation for the first time since the cancellation hit. As Trump stepped up to the podium, his face was a mask of tension. The press room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady, but laced with barely contained frustration. Canada has made a mistake. They've chosen to jeopardize our relationship, to undermine the trust we've built. And I'm not going to stand by while they turn their back on us. Trump's words were forceful, but there was a note of uncertainty beneath them. The damage had been done, and the question on everyone's mind remained, what would happen next? The press briefing did little to calm the storm. In fact, it only fueled the fire. The president's words had been strong, but they lacked the conviction needed to reassure the public and international allies. His critics were quick to point out that his usual bravado had faltered. The public was left wondering if the U.S. was truly as invincible as Trump claimed, or if this was the beginning of a larger foreign policy unraveling. As Trump retreated to the Oval Office, the phone rang constantly, one call after another. World leaders, his advisors, and even his closest allies were all seeking answers. The situation was escalating quickly, and Trump's team realized just how deep the ramifications could go. The Department of Defense had already started assessing damage control strategies. Canada's cancellation of the F-35 deal wasn't just about the lost revenue or the hurt feelings, it had a direct impact on U.S. military readiness. The F-35 program was essential to NATO's defense structure, and the absence of a Canadian partner left a hole in an already strained alliance. We need to stabilize this fast, one of Trump's military advisors said during an emergency strategy meeting. We're not just looking at a diplomatic failure. This could fracture NATO relations at a critical moment. Canada has just sent a signal to the rest of the world that they're willing to turn on us. Trump's frustration boiled over. We can't let them get away with this, he snapped, clenching his fists. They've embarrassed me, they've embarrassed this country, and they've made us look weak. We need a response. The White House began working behind the scenes, quietly pushing back against the cancellation. Leaked reports suggested that Trump was considering economic sanctions against Canada, even as he publicly tried to downplay the gravity of the situation. But no matter what he did, the damage was done. The world was watching, and Canada had positioned itself as a thorn in America's side. Back in Ottawa, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was riding a wave of domestic approval. His decision to walk away from the deal had been portrayed as a bold move to prioritize Canada's interests and cut ties with what he described as unnecessary military expenditures. Trudeau's supporters cheered him on, and the media painted him as a leader who wasn't afraid to stand up to the U.S. This is Canada asserting its independence, one commentator noted. A message to Washington that we don't bend to their every whim. Trump's team knew they had to act fast. The situation was slipping further out of control, and they needed a win to recover from this massive blow. By the end of the week, the diplomatic and political fallout was beginning to spiral beyond anyone's control. Trump's team scrambled to regain the upper hand, but Canada's bold move was reverberating through every level of the political landscape. The president, usually quick to retaliate, found himself trapped between a rock and a hard place. Any drastic measures could escalate tensions further, but doing nothing could signal weakness. Trump knew that the key to regaining control lay in the messaging. His staff had spent hours crafting a response, but nothing seemed to pierce the growing perception that the U.S. had been blindsided by a nation it once considered a close ally. The calls to action became louder with every passing day. Politicians, both Republican and Democrat, began to voice their concerns about the damage to national security and the weakening of global alliances. In the midst of this, Trudeau's popularity continued to rise. The Canadian Prime Minister was everywhere, on television, in print, and on social media, championing his decision to pull out of the F-35 deal. "It's about putting Canadian interests first," he said in a live address to the nation. "And that's what I've done." The optics of it were devastating. Trump, once a master of media control, had lost the narrative. He couldn't let Canada's move stand without a fight, not without risking his political capital. The president's response came swiftly. A late-night tweet read, "Canada may think they can turn their back on the U.S., but they'll soon realize that there are consequences for abandoning strong alliances." The message was clear: Trump wasn't about to let the world think Canada had won this round. He was plotting his next move. But as he sat in the White House, contemplating his next steps, the phone rang again. This time, it was an unexpected call from the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. "Donald," Boris began, "you need to know that the UK is closely watching this situation. We all know that the deal was important, but if this becomes a broader issue of trust, it could have long-lasting consequences." Trump leaned back in his chair, frowning. "So now, the Brits want to weigh in too?" he muttered under his breath. But the truth was, Boris wasn't wrong. The UK, along with other NATO allies, would be directly affected by the tension between the US and Canada. "I'll handle it," Trump snapped. But this is far from over. The diplomatic crisis deepened as the days wore on. Trump's tweet had done little to shift the narrative. If anything, it only amplified the perception that the US was caught off guard and floundering. The administration's responses were becoming increasingly defensive, which only played into Canada's hands. Prime Minister Trudeau, emboldened by the attention and the domestic support he was receiving, doubled down on his stance. The White House, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, began a last-ditch effort to restore its image. Trump's advisors convened daily strategy sessions, trying to figure out how to salvage not just the F-35 deal, but America's standing in the world. Behind the scenes, the president's legal team was already preparing for what could become a drawn-out legal battle with Canada over the terms of the deal. But Trump wasn't known for waiting around. He wanted action, and he wanted it fast. Late one evening, in an attempt to reassert control, Trump announced a series of retaliatory measures. These included the freezing of key trade agreements with Canada, targeting tariffs on Canadian imports, and a strategic reduction in military cooperation. While these moves were symbolic at best, they were meant to send a message that the U.S. would not tolerate being undermined on the world stage. The president, flanked by his closest advisors, delivered a harsh statement. "Canada has made a grave mistake, and they will feel the consequences. We're not just talking about jets here, we're talking about trust. And that's something that's earned, not given." While Trump remained firm, the reality was that the White House's options were running thin. A military response was out of the question, and the economic measures were only going to hurt both countries. What Trump hadn't anticipated was the growing pushback from within his own party. His usual allies in Congress were starting to show signs of discomfort. "We can't afford to lose Canada as an ally," Senator Mitch McConnell told Trump privately, after hearing concerns from a number of Republican lawmakers. "We can't go down this path. We've got bigger fish to fry." McConnell's words struck a chord. Canada wasn't just a neighbor, it was a trading partner, a vital piece of the North American security puzzle. If the U.S. pushed too hard, it risked alienating not just Canada, but other allies in the process. Trump knew he needed to tread carefully, but his ego was at odds with the reality. He'd been publicly humiliated by a country he considered subordinate. The question now was, how far would he be willing to go to win this battle? And would it ultimately cost him more than he could afford? The situation continued to spiral, and the clock was ticking down to a critical moment. As Trump struggled to balance his bruised ego with the reality of an increasingly fractured relationship with Canada, whispers began to spread within his inner circle. The political cost of his response was beginning to outweigh the potential benefits. Behind closed doors, an emergency meeting was called. This time, it wasn't just the usual advisors, it was a gathering of the president's most trusted political operatives, the ones who knew how to play the game in Washington. The room was tense, the weight of the moment palpable. The president was seated at the head of the table, his eyes narrowed in thought. "We need to cut a deal," one of his top advisors suggested, breaking the silence. "This could be a PR nightmare. The longer we drag it out, the worse it's going to get. If we don't act fast, we risk losing not just Canada, but our standing with other allies too." Trump exhaled sharply. "So what do you want me to do? Just apologize?" "No," the advisor quickly replied. "But we need a strategy that shows strength, without looking weak. We should open the door for negotiation, offer a compromise. Let Canada save face while making it clear that there's still value in the relationship." Trump, clearly frustrated, slammed his fist on the table. "I'm not apologizing to Trudeau. But maybe you're right." He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We need to control the narrative. If we don't, this thing could get out of hand." As the meeting wrapped up, a new plan of action was set in motion. Trump would publicly signal his willingness to re-engage in discussions with Canada, offering them a new framework for the deal. The tone would be tough, yet open, strength without surrender. The following day, Trump appeared in front of the cameras again, this time with a different approach. He spoke of the importance of maintaining strong alliances, but in a more measured, less combative tone. He emphasized that the U.S. would continue to work with Canada, but that the relationship would need to be recalibrated. "We can't let one deal define us. We're still partners, and we'll find a way to move forward, on our terms," he declared, trying to walk the fine line between assertiveness and diplomacy. Trudeau, sensing the shift, responded with a statement that offered an olive branch while maintaining his stance. "We remain committed to a strong relationship with the U.S., but we must make decisions based on what's best for our country," he said. The media coverage was mixed. Some praised Trump for taking a more diplomatic tone, while others criticized him for backing down from his initial hardline rhetoric. But what was clear was that both leaders had reached a fragile détente. In the end, the cancellation of the F-35 deal didn't result in a complete rupture of ties between the U.S. and Canada, but it left a scar that would take time to heal. Trump had been blindsided, but in the grand game of international politics, he knew this wouldn't be the last time. And for better or worse, he'd learned a valuable lesson: when it comes to global diplomacy, no one is ever truly invincible. The battle for control over the narrative was over, for now. But the world would be watching closely for the next move.